Hi folks, thanks for joining me again. This is a video screencast that is going to look at linear regression. I'm trying to aim for a shorter version than the one that I've already posted online so that you can have something to use as a quick resource if you don't want to listen again through the 20 minutes of that. Again, what we're predicting in this model is the support for torture. This was asked in a question that looked at whether or not people thought that torture was an effective and desirable thing to be used against people who'd been suspected of terrorism. 1 meant that you strongly disagreed with that. 7 meant that you strongly agreed. And although it's ordinal in nature, we're treating it for the purposes of linear regression as a scaled variable. Linear regression can only be used if the dependent variable is measured as a continuous, that is an interval variable, or in the language of SPSS, as a scaled variable. We're going to predict the use of torture. Our first bivariate analysis is going to look at how an increase in your level of education measured in 4 units either decreases or increases your use of torture on that 7-point scale. Education, again, it's an ordinal variable in nature, probably the way that it's measured here. It looks at people 1 if you have a high school degree or less, up to 4 if you have an advanced degree or more. But as often is the case in statistical modeling, where you're not looking exactly at education as a primary variable, instead just using it as a control, it's not unusual just to keep it as a linear measurement where a 1-unit increase, 2-unit increase, 3-unit increase can be used to measure your level of support for the dependent variable. All right, let's make it happen. Oh, actually, before I do this, just so we don't have to pop back, the other variable that we're going to be looking at is a racism index scale. There were 4 Likert items on the same questionnaire that asked people whether they 1 strongly disagreed, up to 7 agreed, with several statements that were linked and tap into racial animus, things like how much you agree with the idea that using racial profiling is a good idea to catch evildoers or to keep lawbreakers or whatever. The key there was, did you support racial profiling? If so, if you strongly agreed, that would be a 7. If you strongly disagreed, that would be a 1. You add those 4 questions together, you get a scale from 4 to 28, which is a 24-point range variable. There you go. Those are our 2 variables. Regression analysis. Analyze regression. We're doing linear regression. I've already lined these up to begin with. Torture is our dependent variable. Education level is our independent variable. We need do nothing more than go ahead and run the model. First thing that we're going to look at is the R-squared for the model. The R-squared here suggests that education by itself is not telling us a whole bunch of information about who supports torture or not. 0.012 means that a little more than 1% of the total variation in support for torture is due to levels of education. Put another way, over 98% of the variation in a person's level of support for torture has nothing to do with their level of education. We now look down at the model. There is no significant statistic with R-squared. However, you can look at the model's F statistic, and this significance right here basically tells us whether the R-squared is 0 or not. That's another way to interpret it. People almost never put this in the model. They'll put the R-squared for the model and just leave it alone. If it was 0, you don't need this. But just so you know, if this was not statistically significant, what it would be telling us is that the variables that we put in the model tell us nothing meaningful about what predicts, in this case, the dependent variable of support for torture. All right, let's pop down to the stuff you need. R-squared, that gets reported. Here we've only got 1 variable. Just as a reminder, the constant tells us what the level of the dependent variable would be if all other variables in the model were at 0. Education level is 1, 2, 3, 4. Doesn't even have a 0, but the constant is sometimes used in ways to predict levels of support for your dependent variable if you hold the other variables at other values, and because of that, it's put in the model most of the time. Sometimes you'll see regression charts that don't have it in, but usually it's put in. Whether or not it's statistically significant simply measures whether this is 0 or not. For the constant, that doesn't matter, but again, just out of convention, normally the constant, also known as the intercept, will be reported in the regression model at the bottom, and its unstandardized coefficient and its significance will be there. All right, let's interpret what we found. Education level, remember, 1, 2, 3, 4. Each 1 unit increase in level of education corresponds to a negative 0.23 decrease on the 7-point scale we got to remember how our dependent and independent variables are measured, a negative 0.23 decline. Education level, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4. That's 3 unit increase. So if we go to the lowest levels of education, the 1 to the highest levels, that's a 3 unit increase. We can times that times 3, and what we would see is that going from the highest levels of education, or rather the lowest levels to the highest levels, corresponded to a negative 3/4 of 1 point decrease in the level of support for torture on that 7-point scale. That's not all that powerful. So each unit is 1/4 of 1 point decrease. Is it statistically significant? We look over here at the significance. 0.001 means that it is statistically significant. That means we can say with complete confidence, or darn near complete confidence, that higher levels of education, if you control for nothing else, correspond to a decrease in the level of support for torture. Let's add that second variable. Oh, where are we going here? Regression, linear, add the races and the 24 points. Boom. All right, R squared again. All right, oh my. What we can see is that we're nearly 40% of the variation in support for torture is explained by the addition of this variable. That means both the model is much more powerful than it was before, but it also is telling us that racism is a very, very strong predictor of torturing folks for terrorism. If you think about that very hard, that won't surprise you. Pop down here, of course, the model is statistically significant. Our constant, again, tells us on that 7-point scale of notice that it would be below what's even possible on the 1 to 7-point scale. What our level of support for torture would be if you had no education and your racism score would be 0. So if you have no racism and you have no education, you're not going to support torture. Education level, no longer statistically significant. Racism, very powerful. This is not surprising if you think about it. Generally speaking, low-educated people are more likely to be racist and more likely probably to support torture of terrorism suspects. We don't have much data on that second point, but we do know that people who are highly educated, college educated, tend to exhibit lower levels of racism. Does that mean that people with low levels of education are racist? No. In fact, most people are not racist, period. It just means that you're disproportionately more likely to show or exhibit racial animus. Here's the thing. Is it low level of education that's supporting torture, or is it racism? What this tells us is once we control for levels of racism, education no longer has an effect. That is, that racism is overwhelmingly predicting in this model. We can say that controlling, again, for racism, education has no effect. Racism, on the other hand, on that 24-point scale, each 1 unit increase corresponds to nearly 1/5 of a point increase on the 7-point scale. Put another way, on the 24-point range, let's just assume that you went from the very lowest range, 1, up to about midway through, 10. What that says is, move this over here, because 10 times, 10 1-unit increases, 10 times this, you'd see nearly 2.18 points on that 7-point scale gain in support for torture. If you went 20 points, nearly the whole range from the lowest levels to almost the highest levels, then you'd see 20 points difference, or 20 times this, equals almost a 4-point increase on that 7-point scale support for torture. Is this statistically significant? Of course it's statistically significant. Last point, when you look at the standardized beta, it's very typical with regression models. You'll have the beta reported. Sometimes people report the standard error, sometimes they don't. You really don't need that because the statistical significance is measuring the same thing. People will report the unstandardized beta. They also typically report the beta, and the way that that's interpreted is a 1 standard deviation increase in racism corresponded to a 0.617 standard deviation increase in support for terrorism, whereas education level, a 1 standard deviation increase resulted in only a 0.03 standard deviation deduction in the level of support. The reason why standardized coefficients are important, the betas, and the betas are almost always put in there, is it allows us to compare very, very similar things. So, for example, if we had a 1 standard unit increase in income, we could compare that effect to a 1 standard increase in education by looking at them comparatively in standard deviation units, their effect on the dependent variable. And the way that we normally interpret that is we say, if you have these scores over here that have the highest values, that are the most powerful, not highest because it could be negative, but these that deviate the most from 0, we tend to say that they are the strongest variables in predicting, whereas the other ones where standard deviation increase does not have much in effect, one way or the other, then we say, even if they're statistically significant, we would say that they are not as important in predicting the dependent variable. And that, my friends, is getting ahead of myself. So that's going to be another screencast. That, my friends, is linear regression, both the bivariate and the multivariate type explained.